hopefully you'll find this interesting. So this comes from the Scrum Alliance website. This is their diagram for Scrum. And I have a reason for putting this up here. There's a missing meeting in this diagram. Does anyone see what's missing? Grooming, but that's actually not officially in Scrum. Retrospectives, that is right. It's weird to go to Scrum Alliance and see that the retrospective is missing. So the reason it's especially weird for me is because I believe that minimum generative Scrum, meaning like if you had the very minimum amount of stuff in Scrum, what would you put there? A lot of people say we would put daily stand-ups and we would put, planning and that sort of thing. I say something differently. I think that if you have sprint retrospectives, the purpose of those is to set up your experiment. So if you say, what did we do in the past? And ideally, from a metrics point of view, what was our velocity? What was our quality? What was our bug production rate? That sort of thing. And then what process changes could we make to improve the results from the last time we measured? So really the major contribution for Scrum is the beyond Kanban, I would say, is this rhythmic nature, that it forces you to do something every time period. And even if you don't follow all the other rules of Scrum, if all you do is retrospect in an experimental way, you will eventually generate the meetings that are in Scrum in many cases, but not all cases, and maybe that's because those things are not relevant to what you want to do. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about how many companies measure Scrum. They measure it in this way, sort of Nokia test score style. You assess your team and you ask, what's your sprint length? Is it less than 4 weeks? That's good. If it's more than 4 weeks, that's bad. So you get a 1 if it's compliant and a 0 if it's not. How many people have been in organizations where they measured teams in this behavioral way? And any thoughts on the outcomes from those measuring behaviors? Any conclusions from?
I've certainly seen teams that follow the rules and conform to required practices and see very little help.
Yeah.
High suicide rate?
Could be. Yes.
Coaching opportunities might measure feedback.
It's true. So it can have beneficial effects where you're determining that some teams are worth paying attention to. Anything else? Team motivation goes down. Why is that?
Because it's not the value. There's nothing about the value that brings
Yeah. It's a job. We're a machine, a cog in a machine. In addition, I've seen organizations where these behaviors were motivated by pay or promotion. And when I have seen that, guess what I've seen? Lying and gaming. Or basically the same thing, right? Lying and gaming. And so now what is happening is the organization is creating a culture that promotes lying, which is not very beneficial to the organization overall, and it spills out beyond, of course, behaviors and process. So the advantages of these behavioral metrics are compliance is rewarded, it's simple to describe, it maps directly to all the rule books that you read on the web, but it punishes innovators, it doesn't scale very well, self-reporting causes gaming, and in fact, in enterprises particularly, you can have super agile teams that are producing high quality results on a regular rhythm and a very short iteration schedule, but the organization itself is not agile. I've seen that many, many times. So So when we explore metrics, we've seen this before, those of you who attended Larry's talk. There's 7 deadly sins of Agile metrics by Mascherone and McGinnis, and these are them. So motivational metrics, when you start motivating by metrics, it causes all sorts of problems. It's better to forecast, to diagnose problems, or direct attention, as we said with coaching. Unbalanced metrics, where things that kind of have natural opposition, but together they sort of force the organization into a better result. So if you only optimize for revenue, your costs are skyrocketing. If you motivate for cost, you fire everybody and you make no revenue. So those two together are the things that make it work, and so forth. Troy McGinnis added this first moment forecasting as one of the 7 deadly sins, and that is if you're forecasting and you're basing your business on the average forecast outcome, you're going to miss it 50% of the time. So what you need to do is have sort of confidence levels around that. All right, so I did talk about enterprises are not teams. So if you have a bunch of dependencies in an organization, which is present in virtually every large organization, you have the outcome of the entire set of teams dependent on the linkage between the teams. And we'll talk about that in a second. So this sort of component team style where the end result team depends on something else, which depends on something else, which depends on another component and another component. This causes lots of problems. And so we've seen people like Bas Voda advocate feature team structures, but I've never seen feature teams work successfully in a full stack in a large organization. So you usually see this component decomposition at some level in the organization. And then their estimation point scales are not the same. So I do want to talk a little bit about leading indicators and lagging indicators. So a leading indicator is something that you can measure rapidly upon the completion of whatever effort you're doing. A lagging indicator is something that takes a while to appear, but usually is, when we talk about lagging indicators, the ones that we think are important are the ones that relate to the success of the company. So what's a really nice lagging indicator? Anybody have a good example of it? Say again? Revenue. That's a good lagging indicator. Lead time. Lead time, you can kind of measure that quickly. So in some cases, it's a leading indicator. In some cases, you're right, it's a lagging indicator. It's a lagging indicator of maybe the structure of the organization. Stock price is a great lagging indicator. It's what all CEOs really want to optimize, but they really have to rely on leading indicators to help them tune the organization to get that stock price. So here is a leading indicator, release duration. This example comes from Citrix Online, which produces GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, GoToMyPC. And this is a history of the amount of time from the time a project started until the project was shipped. So you see, this here says startup acquired. Previously, this company was known as Expert City, and it was acquired by Citrix around January of 2004. So what you're seeing here is first there was a 10-month release duration. Then it went down to about 7, 10, 12, 14. So that sort of thing. So what's happening here? Is there sort of a trend going on here? Any thoughts about that? Why would that trend be happening? Say again? Well, there is the merger is here. Actually, this was pretty rapid, right? So the company was targeted for being merged, and then it was merged really fast. So what's happening here, though? Yes?
All the resources were going to sales instead of for engineering, so they could maximize the
Could be. It could be.
Like exciting for the acquisition.
They could be getting prepared. So, usually companies don't prepare for acquisition that much, but there's another trend here. It's very similar, right? So they, say again?
Their failure demand is probably eating up more of their capacity to release new features.
Their failure.
Failure demand is eating their capacity to create new features. So they're not building up a releasable set, a compelling set of releasable
Could be. I think, based on my experience with this organization, I think they were accumulating technical debt. So we're measuring the release duration, the amount of time from the inception of a project and a bunch of people are starting to work on it until that project is released. So this company had I think it had a couple of products at this point. Later on, it had 3 or 4 products. So, and I can tell you how this was measured. So this was measured using finance department data. So when you start a project in a company that does capitalize its work, they start capitalizing the work. And then when you release the product, you start depreciating the work. And so the finance department knows the start and end points of every single release. And then I had a really good relationship with the finance department, and that's how I got this data. Does that make sense? So this increasing release duration is, well, it's not necessarily good. If it continues, it takes a long time from the time you start a project to meet market demand, let's say, until you actually meet that demand by shipping the product. Does that make sense? Okay. So the startup was acquired, and now the release duration went down. What do you think caused that? Yeah. Culture? Citrix culture does not necessarily promote that, but okay. Say Greenfield. No, this was. I think the answer to this was a big infusion of staff and demand from the acquiring company that they ship more products. Right. So this did start to happen. Okay, and now you see a progression that we don't have this punctuation of some major disruptive event, and then you see this sort of happening right here. What do you think? I'll just tell you what I think. It's technical debt. All right. This was an accumulation of a bunch of people following a waterfall process, which, as you know, is not focused on how do we become more efficient, either in the Kanban sense or in the Scrum sense. You're just doing what seems intuitively reasonable. And then that happened. So around this time, Citrix created its first Agile team, which was kind of a conglomeration of a few characteristics of agility. The first real Scrum team was here in late 2007. We had a mass Scrum Master training here, and then we started imposing Enterprise Scrum, which is rank ordering projects by priority and staffing them until we ran out of teams, and then not staffing anything below the point that we had people. So it was much more focused, and you can see this radical drop in terms of release duration, and it was pretty successful. So that was a leading indicator, and then here is a lagging indicator that seems to relate to that leading indicator, and that is that around this time, the market share of Citrix Online increased, and it did increase past this date as well. So Citrix Online trumped Microsoft in this time frame. It kept growing while Microsoft went down, basically. All right. So I'm going to talk about a few other metrics that are interesting, and they're basically I'll just go through them. So one of the things that we talk about in this whole track is forecasting. So when might something actually ship? Scrum has inside it an ability to forecast. It's one of the properties of Scrum that made it better, I would say, than waterfall strategies where we were also trying to forecast. The value of Scrum forecasting is it's statistically responsible. So instead of assuming that an estimated time is an actual time, there's a built-in mapping from the estimates that programmers or team members have to the actual outcomes, and that's this term velocity. How many people actually use Scrum in their production environments? So about half or a third. And how many of those people actually estimate? Or actually, it doesn't matter. Whether you're lean or Scrum, do you estimate? How many? So half. So these estimates are either estimated programmer days or story points. It doesn't really matter. Let's suppose that we have a velocity of 50. All right? And we want to find out when can I ship this item. As a site member, I can mark my email address as private, even if the rest of my profile is not. All right? So if we have a velocity of 50, about how long will that take? Say again? 6 sprints. Any other answers?
It's hard to say with the question marks in there.
Hard to say with the question marks in there, right? So by Scrum rules or this estimation strategy, if we want to be statistically responsible, we have to know what these question marks are, because this is the rank order of when these things will be produced. So the forecast horizon, defined this way, is the point at which we have data and no further. So the horizon is here, right after item number 7. So about how many sprints worth of data do we have? So we have 50 points per sprint. How many sprints is this? About 4, right? About 4 sprints. So if we have 2-week sprints, how long is our forecast horizon in time? 8 weeks. So we've got an 8-week forecast horizon. So that's kind of interesting, right? We can say, okay, anybody who's telling us a delivery date that is later than 4 weeks is not being responsible, I would say. Okay? That's at least the theory behind Scrum. And so if that's true, that's kind of interesting. So I said that, I said, okay, anybody who's giving me dates that are further out than the forecast horizon, that's not a believable date, even by the rules of Scrum. And so then in applying this idea and saying, hey, product owners, we would like you to push your forecast horizon up so that you could actually responsibly forecast a date, let's work on that. So what I ended up seeing in an organization with about 200 teams was over half of the teams had a backlog that looked like this. So no estimates on the topmost things in the backlog. Forecast horizon 0, right? And then I said, okay, well, that's the worst possible thing. The next worst possible thing is at least you can estimate roughly 1 sprint's worth of work. That means that you have prepped your team, they go into a planning session, and they roughly know what they're going to have to do, and so that they can thoughtfully prioritize this work and think about how it would be done. But still, it's pretty low. And so here is a case where you're using the forecast horizon as a capacity judge, deciding how much capacity can you actually take in the next sprint. So in pushing this idea further, I found that people would start doing this. A lot of Scrum people have been trained that these product backlog items should be small in order to be consumable within a sprint. And they carry this notion further all the way down. Like if someone pushes them to expand the forecast horizon, they end up doing that in a huge number, right? So more than 50 stories. And it got very onerous for teams. They would have to estimate. I went to one team, they had 200 stories estimated. And the product owner said the team kept complaining because the grooming sessions were so long. I said, okay, that does make sense. So I started pushing teams to do this. And as you see, it has this sort of fractal nature to it. So stories that are coming right up are small, and they could be accepted into a sprint. As you get further and further down, you see bigger and bigger numbers. And this actually turned out to be really beneficial. What do you think we saw in teams that had backlogs that look like this?
You can see uncertainty represented better.
Yeah, you can see uncertainty represented better. Here is a situation, and you have to teach teams to estimate this way because many of them will complain about it. You say, I'm only interested in one significant digit. And so what you see here is what I call decimal Fibonacci numbers. So only the first digit is Fibonacci and the rest are just decimal zeros. So that's true. They understand the uncertainty. What else? Less time estimating for sure. That's true. What I saw was architectural thinking. So what I saw in this case, when teams were able to view what was coming up, when they were able to see in the backlog of product vision expressed, then they were starting to think about architectural issues, because these things were things like implement disaster recovery across multiple sites. Okay, that would be a backlog item that might have 200 in it. So I started thinking of forecast horizon not just as a measure for the ability for you as a product owner to tell me what date it would be delivered, but more that it was actually motivating architectural thinking in teams. And so I started thinking of this as a measure for the communication rate between the product owner and the team. Okay, so we'll move to a different metric. External bug count. You're probably familiar with this, but I'll be specific about my definition. External bug count is the bugs that are identified by people outside the team. So those bugs, of course, are quality-related issues affecting real stakeholders. In many companies, bugs are registered by the teams themselves, and those bugs may or may not be visible to an outsider. So a bug, of course, has two problems associated with it. One is there's a symptom, incorrect code, bad user experience, but it also points to a process issue, that things are escaping the team that have problems in them. And so many advocates suggest that you should have 0 known bugs when you ship. But in fact, that doesn't happen very often. So what we do see is something that looks like this, that we have a bunch of bugs that start accumulating, and then they hit our oh shit level, and then we all come to Jesus, and we say, oh my gosh, we should, fix all those bugs, and we say, let's do 0 bugs, and we bring it down. This is what my inbox looks like. Right? So the symptoms are fixed, and then you just keep accumulating, and the symptoms are fixed, and you just keep accumulating. And the problem is that you haven't addressed the real problem. So teams that move towards an external bug count goal of 0 will actually start affecting their process. And it's also true that if you lower the number of acceptable bugs over time, they gradually improve their process. The result is the risk for disastrous bugs hitting your customer base is lower.
Are you this seesaw pattern? I see that all the time in looking at data.
Yeah.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or?
Well, it says that all you're affecting is the symptoms. So it's better than, that, right? But I think it is a bad thing. It means that the team is not really using the retrospective process of Scrum to reflect on their process and actually fix their process. So their process is probably not improving. Right, the root cause hasn't been fixed. Say it again? Yep. Yep. So if you're really serious about getting your bug count permanently down, you'll actually improve the process so the quality is more consistently good, basically. And oftentimes it makes coding production faster. Yes?
So you're saying that the bug count is down, right? Can you go to the next slide for a second?
Yeah.
You have the positive level.
Yeah.
I guess the current bug count that is acceptable, right?
Right. Some executive notices.
So the way the bug count for this level, the both lag indicators are actually relying on this kind of measures as well.
What other measure would you use?
Well, I mean, first of all, by only reacting on something.
Oh, yes. The threshold is definitely a lagging indicator. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you end up using that as well,
Right. Just the bug count itself is perhaps a leading indicator, where the oh shit level threshold traversal is, yes. Yeah, the trend is actually a great level. If you can get this line to have a lower slope, you're in better shape. Yeah.
Is this because they're noticing the code doing stuff quite quickly and states the background's still going on?
It could be many things. Automated testing could be inadequate. You could have a situation where the engineers are not willing to test themselves unless the threshold is exceeded. There's a whole bunch of characteristics that I've seen in this case. But and pair programming or code reviews. If you have consistent use of pair programming code reviews, you can get the slope down. So, all right. I like to talk about true sprint length as opposed to regular sprint length. And regular sprint length, at least in my experience, this is what teams say. They say, our sprint length is 2 weeks. And then I started realizing, you'll see why I started realizing this in a minute. I started realizing that I had to ask them some detailed questions in order to find out how frequently they really could release. Okay? With 200 teams, everybody is, declaring their sprint length. I would go to probably at least 30% of the teams that I would go to, they would say our sprint length is 2 weeks. And you spend a little time with them and you discover, well, they really can't release this thing. They really can't release this thing. They actually have to go through a localization step, which sometimes took a week or two. Testing, sometimes was done exclusively by people. And so I started using this term true sprint length instead of what you declared it to be. And the reason I did that is because I started looking at these things. And I will zoom in on a few of these things. This is a static dependency graph. You can get this by talking to architects or talking to individual team members. This is a set of teams. In our case, it was a scrum of scrums grouping of feature teams, but they were all working on a component, if you will. So these are components that have dependencies on each other. This is something that faces the end user. This is a very basic library. Does it make sense what I'm showing here? Okay. So we can zoom in a little bit, and we can look at this. We can talk about something I wanted to calculate quickly, which was lead time. What was the amount of time that it would take if you fixed something in the base library and propagated it up through the dependency graph, all the way to the end user, how long would that take? So we can do this game ourselves a little bit. We can say, let's pretend that this is facing an end user, this thing called home. And then it depends on Windows, and then it turns out that Windows depends on something at this level. And let's pretend that it's actually this, that it's 2 weeks. And that this depends on this, that's 2 weeks. And this, we know, depends on the standard library, which is 4 weeks, 2 weeks. Well, this is 4 weeks, this is 4 weeks, 4 weeks, and then, let's see. I guess we can say this depends on this, 2 weeks to 4 weeks, 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks. So we can follow this chain up. 2 plus 2 is 4, plus let's be conservative and say 4, 8, 12, 16, 18, 20, 28, 30 weeks. Is that right? Is that how long this will take? It will take 30 weeks, assuming that we have to go through a full sprint cycle all the way to the end. 30 weeks. Does that sound right? Any problems with that calculation? It could be continuous integration within the team, but not through the whole. Yes, you're right. Not through the whole system. So 30 weeks? 30 weeks? Nope, not 30 weeks. Because in virtually every organization that has this many teams, the sprint cycles are not synchronized. Okay? The day, even the week of the sprint timing is going to be completely random. So what could we do? 30 weeks, going up to here. There's a simple calculation. Anyone have it? On average, a team is going to consume something in the middle of its, something's going to be available in the middle of its sprint cycle. So on average, we could multiply 30 weeks by 50% to get the average delay. So now 30 weeks becomes 45 weeks to get all the way through to here. Does it make sense? Ish? So this is kind of a theory, right? This is not necessarily reflecting reality. It's looking at a static map and saying, what can we infer from this map? And so you would have to go out and validate it. And I will admit I didn't do a statistically responsible validation, but I did go through to groups in this organization and say, my map predicts that if you have something that affects something down here, that it's going to take you, in this case, 45 weeks. And I discovered that it was pretty much right on. In other words, you can look at an organization's dependency graph and structurally predict how long it's going to take things. What is the lead time to get stuff out of the company? You can do this yourself. The first time I did it, I interviewed individual managers and asked them who they depended on. The second time I did it, I got a bunch of architects in a room with a bunch of sticky notes, and I put all the team names on the sticky notes, and I said, please organize these teams from top to bottom, from customer-facing to lowest level dependency. And then, they did what we always do with swarming and sticky notes. And then I said, please draw the arrows for me, which they did. And then I just transcribed that into a graph, and it was actually much faster that way. So you can do it too. Another thing is dependency count. So here is a standard library, and there are 15 things that depend on it. What does this help me with? What is this metric good for? Say again? Prioritizing. Prioritizing what? Say again?
Identify the bottleneck.
Yes, this is a bottleneck, potentially. It could change the statistics around the forecast horizon, the second order moment, for example. But what else? Yes, a lot of communication has to happen with this team. Yes. Yes, yes. This thing is really about risk. This is probably one of the riskiest thing in that giant graph, because if this team sucks in any way, the whole thing sucks. So what we started looking at was dependency counts as a reason to motivate talking to these people and getting their process really good. Okay? So instead of focusing coaching attention, for example, if you have a set of coaches that can't cover the entire 200 team group, you want to know who you should pay attention to, and this is one of the ones you should pay attention to. And sadly, in this particular organization, this was one of the most dysfunctional groups in the entire company, and everybody depended on it. So I've talked about 5 metrics that relate to risk in an organization. So forecast horizon, and originally when we started talking about it, we said the risk was all around scheduling, right? And we talked about moments and that sort of thing. But in fact, bad architecture is also a risk that this helps uncover. So if forecast horizon is higher, the architecture risk is much lower. External bug count, obvious things, quality perceptions, and then the risk that the team can't detect or prevent disasters. The true sprint length, there's a risk of rework. So you saw how we said there were 2-week sprints, but the real true sprint length was 8. So that meant there was a lot of danger of rework in those organizations. And so I would spend time with people who had true sprint lengths of 8, who declared themselves to have 2-week sprints, and I said, please, could you do me a favor? Could you declare your sprint length to be 4 weeks, and then work to actually make your true sprint length 4 weeks also? I'd rather have you tell the truth, tell people your sprint length is 8 weeks right now, and then let's try to work it back so that it's 4 weeks, something reasonable. Concept of cache, this idea of flowing through the graph, and dependency count as who will benefit from help. So which teams will benefit most from the help? So just looking at the teams, who needs help? Forecast horizon is low, high external bug count, high true sprint length. We would take coaches and we would say, where are we going to spend our time? We're going to spend our time on teams that would benefit most from our help. So if you have a high forecast horizon, if you have very little bugs, if your sprint length is low, more power to you. You don't need our help. In addition, we started looking at which teams would help, that if we helped them, would most benefit the company. And now you're talking about dependency count. So even if that team with 15 dependencies was awesome, it might be well worth our while to focus on them and get them even better, because that would help the whole company. Similarly with lead time contribution. So if that team is in the middle of something, we might structurally reorganize so that that team would merge with another team, and then we might lose a level in that graph. And losing a level in that graph buys us a few weeks. Does it make sense? All right. So I'm not going to talk about that. I will talk about this, and that is we got so that the coaching team, which I was a part of in this organization, would actually say whenever we would engage with a team, we would work with the team to create a joint project to improve a metric. And we would get mutual agreement on that. That would be a consensus sort of thing. We would go in and we'd say, hey, you know, we just noticed that your forecast horizon was 0, and then here's the effect of that. Would you like some help with that? Or you might be interested in some other things. Do you want to agree to do a project with us? And the team oftentimes would say, yes, we really want that because our product owner isn't really talking to us very much. And so we would start a project because everybody agreed, and we would put it on our list of things we're working on. And this was a report. So this is a quarterly report that we would give to executives to tell them how spending money on the coaching team was benefiting the company. So you see some of these projects ended in success, and some of them were still ongoing. This one, sadly, and this one, especially annoying, which was some team wanted to improve their utilization rate by reducing the amount of time that they spend on Scrum meetings, which seems questionable. All right, and that's it. Any questions? Questions? Yes?
Yeah, so lead time metrics you tell me about it. Has it including it for lead time was it really a kind of idea to live, or was it just when the first team started working on it?
The intention of that was just to say what would be the minimum amount of time if everybody shipped at the end of their true sprint length. If, you know, the change was affecting something at the bottom of the dependency tree. And what it caused was, of course, you could forecast those things, which was good. But in addition, what we saw was managers started looking at this and saying, you know, I guess we sort of organically created these component teams not thinking about the effect of the particular decomposition that we made to make those component teams. Let's rejigger that. So I saw in 2 cases where people looked at this graph and they said, okay, we're going to refactor our organization to reduce the levels in that transition. And of course, it made things faster. Others? Yes?
Back to the forecast horizon, I can definitely understand the advantages of giving somebody some foresight into what's coming up from an estimation perspective. But I wonder about, especially in estimates around 100 and 200, if you ran into the case where, or if you're aligning it with the amount of change that's going into your script. It's a lot of things that we find it's difficult when you're forecasting out, 6 months or more, and you're not paying attention to the demand being the new demand coming in.
True.
That kind of setting expectations too early.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I guess that is a secondary problem in most organizations. The first primary problem is that the forecasts are made on backlogs like this, or they're just guessed, right? Like someone gives you a target date. So with Citrix Online, for example, one of the things that we started doing was saying, we demand that product owners tell us when a project will complete, when their target date. We would say, we need your target date. And then, we got objections initially from some Agile people who said, well, we don't talk about dates. And we kept saying, we're not asking the team, we're asking the product owner, what's their target date? And so the product owner would give a target date. And then we would go through and we would do this type of estimation with the backlog. And we would say, if we had a situation like this where there were question marks up to the actual set of PBIs that were necessary to complete that project, if there were question marks, we would call that red, meaning that that target date is not achievable. Or as far as we know, it's statistically not responsible to say that's achievable. If it was within the boundaries of this, we would say it was achievable. And so that meant that we would have Scrum Masters or coaches calculate the forecast date, basically. And so that imposed this kind of rigor that really helped even product owners understand the implications of what they were doing. So I agree with you that getting this, of course there's questions plus or minus 100, right, over here. And so if you're not paying attention to that second moment of the forecast, then you'll definitely run into problems there. But if you are, then I guess the problems are not that serious. The big serious problems are things where product owners are making estimates based on their own gut. So, I don't know. That probably doesn't answer you satisfactorily, but I'm trying to do my best.
I'd probably argue that they should turn around at some point if your assumption that none of these are going to change or be impacted in the next 6 months.
Yeah, some people do forecast horizons that include historical introduction of new features into the backlog, and so you kind of get this one line will be going down, your burn down, but then you'll also have this other line that's not right at the axis. It's actually also sort of going down as product owners add stuff to the backlog. And then sometimes you find they don't even converge, which is really horrible, of course. Anything else? Okay, thanks again, and have a great conference.